It's a really normal day for me to have over 160 notifications on this. Plus, all of my devices are linked, so I get notifications on my phone, my iPad, my laptop, my iMac, like everywhere. But we are living in a world of distraction. And actually, distraction is defined as a thing that prevents someone from giving full attention to something else. Does that feel like your life? So the French word actually for distraction was used as a name for one of their torture methods. I do have to give the credit to early humans. Like, they were some sick, sadistic people. Like, they knew how to torture someone to inflict the most amount of pain possible. So what would happen on this distraction torture method is they would actually tie each one of the appendages of a person's body to different horses, and they would actually pull the person apart. It's called death by distraction. Anybody else think that they're living that out? I think it's a pretty accurate summary of our lives. And at times we can even say that about Jesus's. So if you look at the last two chapters, there's all kinds of distractions in Jesus's life. From crowds to storms to scared disciples to people in need all around him. He was constantly surrounded with distractions. So how are we to handle all of the distractions that are in our life? I've read all the books, I've listened to all the podcasts, and I know don't let the urgent interrupt the important. Someone else's lack of planning or lack of executing that plan doesn't dictate an emergency in your life. Like, I can quote you all the leadership talks on how priorities are supposed to be established, but what do I see Jesus do? First thing I see him do is he discerns the demands. So we see in verse 21 of chapter 5, he's there preaching, and he's preaching to the masses, and they've waited to hear him speak and teach. And so he can be surrounded by hundreds or maybe even thousands, but Jesus is interrupted by a man named Jairus with news that his daughter is sick and is about to die. And I see this story, and it challenges me. Jesus is speaking to all of these people, teaching hundreds or thousands of people maybe. And Jesus hears about one little girl and begins to go with Jairus to heal her. So this is a conflicting moment for me as like a pastor, like, oh, I don't know. Because I think it'd be easily justified for his response to say, hey, let me finish up here. And when we wrap up for the day, I'm going to go with you. Let me put this in context. I'm speaking on a Sunday morning. Someone bursts in the middle of a service, comes running up to the stage and says, Pastor, I need you to come pray for my kid. They're sick and we need you right now. And what happens in this story is I walk off the stage and go with him. What would be running through your head at that moment? You would have thought like you were getting slighted, right? Like that's exactly what you've been thinking. But I think verse 24 is pretty powerful when it says this. So Jesus went with him. This large crowd followed and pressed all around him. And the only thing that we can imagine is that Jesus is discerning the demands on his life, because it doesn't make sense at all to leave the crowd, but here goes Jesus. Now the story continues and we meet this new, I'll use the word insignificant character. So Mark 5 verses 25 through 28 really describes this interaction. But the first character, we know his name and his profession, and now enters this woman with the issue of blood, and she's been bleeding for the last 12 years, and she's exhausted all of her resources. She's been to every doctor, she's tried every wives' tale, done every home remedy, but nothing has brought wholeness to her. But she places her focus on Jesus, and she fights through the crowd, and she presses in, and she touches his garment. Now, Jesus is on this way to save this little girl's life. Like, that's a pretty important moment, right? Like, and it's not just any little girl, but it's the little girl of a very important religious leader. And so Jesus stops and he turns around and he asks, who touched me? The reason that Jesus wants to stop is because he knows he was touched. And the second time, the second point we need to know is it's not a distraction when you've been touched. It's not a distraction when you've been touched. So in verse 30, we see this. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and he asked, who touched my clothes? So Jesus knew that when he was touched, power went out from him. So we are spirit-led people. And as we are trying to discern the demands of life, we have to be able to recognize that when someone touches us, it's that moment, it doesn't matter what the demands are, who you are, who they are, about what's going on in you or around you, because in that moment, you know that a supernatural moment has been created. Once again, this moment goes against every leadership principle, because what's the more urgent need? The little girl who's about to die and you are the only one that can save her, or a woman who's been dealing with a condition that she's dealt with for 12 years. So little girl's need is more urgent, and in this story, who's the more important person or issue? That's right, Jairus. And so once again, we see Jesus make a decision that's contrary to our way of thinking. But in that moment, that Jesus is not only providing a physical healing, but he's providing emotional wellness to this woman. And so Jairus gets a message that says in verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? I can imagine the thought of Jairus and the disciples in this moment. Well, Jesus, you screwed this one up. Why'd you waste the time with this woman? You could have saved her. The disciples think, do you realize the opportunity that you could have had here? Do you understand who Jairus is? Do you understand what this could have done for us in the Jewish community? Do you understand what could have been possible? I find it interesting. Something changes. He tells Jairus to believe, and then he sends the crowd away and only lets Peter, James, and John follow him. So sometimes we have to put an end to distractions. And I think that's the third thing you realize today. Sometimes we have to put an end to distractions. Look at verse 37. He did not let anyone follow him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So he stops the distractions. And when he arrives in what the Bible calls a commotion. And when all of those that are there grieving this loss. So common Jewish practice they would actually hire those to come grieve at a funeral at the house of someone who died. And Jesus immediately comes in and he asks, look at verses 38 through 40, says, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? This child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. So after he put them all out, he took the child's father, mother, and the disciple who were with him and went in where the child was. It shows us that these were just that, professional mourners. They're not family, because those that are actually mourning don't laugh at hope. But then there's this short phrase that I think we can really learn from. After he had put them all out. And we know the rest of the story, that the little girl's healed, but not until after he had put out all the distractions. He stopped the distractions in the street, and we see that his mission is fulfilled. I think we need to take some advice from Jesus' playbook and close the door on some of the distractions in our life, to push them out of the room, to leave them in the street. And some of you have people in your life that you need to close the door on, because all they are is commotion and drama. Tonight, what I want you to know that we're all faced with, it can be known as a distraction. Every sermon, every play session, every coloring session, every business proposal. But what we have to do is discern the demands in our life. We got to recognize the moments that touch us, and we got to close the door to avoid missing the greater thing God wants to see accomplished in our life. So our lives are full of distractions. But we have to remember to keep our eyes and our spirit open to discerning what's a distraction and what's actually God's design for our day. So keep your eyes open as you face all the things that we have to in every day.